Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so like Beth said, welcome and thank you all for being here bright and early in the morning, depending on where you are. So our presentation today is going to be on how counselors can advocate for early childhood clients within the school system to reduce systemic bias. So we're going to be looking at recognizing that several of you likely work with school-aged children who may be referred to you from the school system for potential misconduct or other behavioral issues in the school system. And oftentimes these referrals and these concerns are actually due to systemic bias that these children may be facing in the school system, and how us as counselors or you as counselors can be the ones to advocate for them to ensure equitable outcomes. So it appears some of the slides don't feel to want to work today, but this is supposed to have photos of us for our introduction. So Beth, why don't you go ahead and give a quick intro on yourself, and imagine you see another picture of our faces on the slide.
Yep. So I'm Beth Boyle. I'm part of the Ideals Institute at the School of Education at Johns Hopkins, and my background is in early childhood special education. I also have a master's in psychology, and I have worked as a behavior specialist. I train teachers and childcare providers in early childhood special education. And I kind of come to this work from my behavior background.
So I am Rohan Arcot. I work as a teaching assistant and a research assistant with the Johns Hopkins School of Education. I have a master's in clinical mental health counseling from Johns Hopkins and a bachelor's in psychology from Hamilton College. And courses that I teach include both research methods and diversity and social justice. So this presentation is kind of a blending of those two interests, as well as the research work that I do with Beth in the Ideals Institute, as well as a couple other research labs at Hopkins, focusing on multicultural counseling competencies, social justice and diversity issues in counseling, and really understanding what it is that we as counselors, how we need to adapt some of our methods and what we do to respond to client needs in 2021.
Right. So at first, we'll be focusing on kind of the overview of the effects of implicit bias on young children, particularly in the areas of suspension and expulsion rates in early childhood programs. And then we'll review some techniques to reduce implicit bias, and then some program level interventions and practices to reduce implicit bias. Anything you want to add, Rohan?
No, I think you covered it nicely. What we're going to be doing. So it's viewing this through the lens of you as counselors may be advocating for clients in the school system is how we're approaching the framing of this presentation for today. So before we go into the meat of the presentation, we wanted to get a sense from the folks in the room of what does implicit bias mean to you. So it looks like we had a poll in the PowerPoint. It doesn't look like it's working properly, which is the second time in 2 days that has happened to me. Welcome to remote presentations. So if you could put in the chat, and let us know what the term implicit bias means to you and what it means to you in the work that you do. So take a moment and let us know your thoughts in the chat. Okay, so Beth, we can go ahead and define how we'll be using the terms implicit and explicit bias for today.
So I know this is this is in the literature and in the news quite a bit these days, implicit bias and explicit bias. So we're going to focus on implicit bias, but certainly not, we certainly see the effects of explicit bias in this work as well. The implicit bias affects decisions, perspectives, and behavior, even with the best of intentions. So you may, or someone may be thinking they don't have these values or beliefs, and yet it will still show up in people's decisions and behaviors. You'll particularly see this under something called vulnerable decision-making points. So if somebody's under stress or depressed or has to do something quickly or is multitasking, that's when you tend to see more evidence of implicit bias. So why are we looking at this? We see evidence of implicit bias early, and the effects can be long-term. We know there is implicit bias across all these systems listed here. So for example, in education, in opportunity gaps, in discipline practices, in employment, with earning capacity, employment rates, discrimination, in the criminal justice system, everything from policing strategies to sentencing and courtroom dynamics, health in terms of access and quality of care disparities, trust of healthcare professionals, maternal mortality, infant mortality, pain management, and then mental health, which is where you guys probably know more than I do about this, in terms of service availability, quality of assessment, diagnosis and treatment. So those already exist. And now, if a child is experiencing implicit bias in early childhood, this can exacerbate what is already happening in this system. This is setting the stage for long-term outcomes for a child. And that's what we really want you to be aware of. If a young child is dismissed from a program, suspended, excluded from a program, you see long-term effects. There's a higher rate of dropout, poor grades in schools, and then a cascade of these adult long-term outcomes. That all, is all set in the stage of early childhood. So some of you may have seen pieces of this in the news. Black preschoolers are dismissed from programs at a much, much higher rate than their white peers. There's a very famous story very famous study by Dr. Walter Gilliam and his colleagues. He's the one who first identified this disparity in the rates of suspension and expulsion. But he conducted a study with early childhood educators and child care providers. He had them all watch young children sitting around a table playing, and he asked them to monitor the children to see when was a challenging behavior about to start. What he didn't tell them was that all the children were actors and there would be no behavior problems. And he also monitored where they looked. He used eye tracking technology to see which children were looked at most. And he had a boy and a girl, black, and a boy and a girl, white. And they all played around the table. And it turns out teachers thought, they were then asked, who did they monitor the most? And they said they monitored the boys. But what was true was the black children were monitored more through eye gaze, and black boys at a much higher rate than anyone else. So we know that black children represent 19% of preschool enrollment, but 47% of the preschool children receiving one or more out of school suspensions. The rate of suspensions and expulsions, it's dropping, but there's still that same disparity. So we know implicit bias is behind this. Okay, so our challenge in terms of advocacy, this is what we want you to be aware of. You're going to be advocating for children, and it doesn't really matter the age. It's great if you're able to advocate for young children, but we also want you to be aware of what may have happened for children in their past. So we want to be addressing biases and racism. We obviously know this is tough to change. It's uncomfortable. People may be resistant. All of this will depend on the level of advocacy you will be undertaking. So you'll want to plan out your approach, knowing these things. Getting buy-in will be critical. Figuring out what will be the motivator or the hook that gets people engaged in making these changes. And with your roles, you'd be engaging with the schools because it's going to have to be a system level change to advocate for young children or children who are experiencing bias. And then, just tapping into that commitment to change with long-term goals and supports. It has to be a vision with accountability built into the plan. And Rohan, take it away.
Yeah, so the question then becomes, how do we do this? What theories ground this, what that ground that we use in our work, and how do we as counselors conceptualize this? Because this may not be something that we as counselors have been trained to do or know to do all the time. And we can look to the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies for a framework of what our obligation as counselors is and how to go about it. The MSJCC by Ratz et al., they outline how we need to focus on self-reflection to unlearn certain biases in our attitudes and beliefs, our need to read and ask questions to build knowledge and skills, and ultimately fulfill our mission as advocates by taking action to ensure equitable outcomes for our clients. And as we move through this presentation, we will discuss information related to attitudes, beliefs, knowledge, and skills, as well as how to move from those three towards action. Bronfenbrenner's Ecological Systems Theory also outlines a framework for us to consider in unpacking the different levels that our clients are affected at. In this visual here, you can see elements such as family, classroom, and peer group within the mesosystem and the microsystem, but also see and understand how the larger school system and society are influenced at the exosystem and the macrosystem levels. And what's so great about Bronfenbrenner's theory is that it offers an important reminder to us to view clients holistically and to understand the systemic factors influencing their lives. That what we were just talking about with implicit bias, it operates at the individual level, the group level, and the systems level. And us as counselors, we have to be able to understand those different levels and how they're playing out for our clients. And then lastly, the biopsychosocial model gives us a way to view these conceptualizations through a counseling lens. That Bronfenbrenner, MSJCC, tripartite models are all things that you may remember those terms from your counseling programs, or if your counseling students may be annoyed to hear about them in another space. But the biopsychosocial model is really what in the counseling space and in professional practice, what we use in our intakes and our assessments. And when you're conducting a BPS for clients, specifically those who are children from marginalized backgrounds with issues in the school system, it's imperative to use the BPS as an advocacy tool by paying attention to the social and the psychological elements at all levels and how those specifically are influencing the client's behavior, and more importantly than the behavior, the perception of that behavior, how what you may be hearing from the school or from the family, the community, how they are operating at the different levels to unpack what it is that is going on, and if there may be some implicit bias at play here. So now we're going to transition into a conversation about implicit bias and specifically the research on implicit bias and implicit bias training, with the idea that this information, again, going back to this is, knowledge and skills can serve as a toolkit that you can use when conducting systems level advocacy for your clients in schools. And the research can inform us about what makes for an effective implicit bias training, specifically what is necessary to create meaningful and lasting change that has impact. That when you go into the school system, what you propose to them, what you tell them of, hey, here's what you can do to actually improve the situation that is creating issues for you, not just for the individual student, but also for all students in the school. And now this group of researchers, Devine, Forscher, Austin Cox, and a few others, they spent over 30 years studying implicit bias and identifying factors that make a difference. And through their work, which has been corroborated by numerous others, they have found the three major components that create impact are, number one, a training that increases awareness of bias, and more critically, builds concern for the consequences of bias in individuals, because it is that concern that leads to people applying strategies to ultimately reduce bias. So all three of these in tandem have the potential to reduce bias and support early childhood students equitably. Going through those three different elements, the first piece of those trainings and really in reducing implicit bias is increasing awareness of bias in a manner that people are receptive to hearing. And these researchers found that a training which has participants take the implicit association test, also called the IAT, which several of you are likely familiar with, and using those results as a training tool increases awareness of bias. Now, I'm not saying go into a school and say, hey, you have implicit bias, let's all go take an IAT, but understand how a tool like the IAT can give a baseline and a framework to start those conversations. And the IAT, it seeks to measure implicit bias or biases that we are not conscious of by having participants associate Black or white faces with positive or negative words. And this categorization, it happens very quickly, which means our conscious thoughts and views are not present in classifying. And in their research, 90% of participants, regardless of race, showed a bias favoring white faces over Black faces. We want to be very clear that this does not mean 90% of people are racist or prefer white people, that we have been primed through societal factors and cultural conditioning just by existing in this Western society and in America to have an unconscious preference for white faces over Black faces. And that's, again, the result of living in a majority white society with power structures dominated by white individuals. And there have been numerous critiques against the IAT. However, most notably for us is that implicit bias does not predict explicit behavior. And in this case, we are more interested in the result of bias rather than whether a bias is implicit or explicit. Earlier, Beth went through the difference between implicit and explicit bias. And while we're talking about implicit bias as sort of a mechanism that occurs, it's really how that implicit bias is manifested through explicit bias that we need to be discussing. Moreover, other researchers have found that only 20% of racial preference is captured by the IAT. To date, though, it is still the best measure of implicit bias that we have. And for training purposes, again, as a catalyst to having the conversation, it can serve us well to start having the difficult conversation about race and bias. And in our resources slide at the end, we include a link for the IAT, and we invite you to take it if you've never taken one before. It can maybe illuminating for you and just seeing how that process goes for you. So now, after taking, participants were randomly split into two groups. One who received a training and one who did not. And again, this is just in the research studies. So in your situations, everyone would receive the training that you would maybe conduct for a school or encourage a school to do on their own. So in a 45-minute education and training session, so participants received an explanation of their IAT scores and learned about implicit bias. And they were also crucially introduced to several strategies which have been shown to curb bias. And then for the next 8 weeks, they were encouraged to practice these strategies and document what they did. Now, there are several things for us to keep in mind when designing or choosing or recommending a training for a school to use, and we'll continue to discuss, including creating buy-in from an administrative level so that people feel safe to explore their bias and engage in these vulnerable and courageous conversations. It is also recommended to be mindful of who is doing the training, just to facilitate a safe environment that supports teachers and staff by identifying anti-bias practices as a school-wide value, going back to how you achieve buy-in is through values and commitment. Now, one of the major findings in this study was that a concern for bias was only cultivated in participants who received the training, and that concern for bias is a key element in predicting future behaviors and lower future bias. So really, when you're having these conversations in schools, it's making it clear that this is something that educators and school systems that they should be concerned about. And it appears that this concern is long-lasting because it remained throughout the 2 months of the study. And in a follow-up study years later, participants who received the training were more likely to speak up against bias. That finding is so critical for us and for all of you because it shows that these interventions can have a long-term impact, and notably that they impact measurable, explicit behavior. Again, the difference between implicit bias, explicit bias, and moving from thoughts to behavior. And again, these results, they can only happen in environments where that learning and concern are encouraged by all parties, which can be signaled, again, by making anti-bias a core value. And going into the weeds a little bit of that study, this is, again, just to give you a few ideas of what type of strategies are useful so that, if you're working with a school system, like, we're not really going to invest in an implicit bias training. That's a lot of money. We're not, if they're not fully bought in, one thing you can come back and say is, okay, I hear that, that's not something you may be ready to do right now. However, here are a few strategies that are, simple, free, and that you may be able to use. So we're going to go through 5 different strategies that have been shown to help reduce bias. So the first is replacing stereotypes through a reflective process where you identify a thought as a stereotype, understand why it occurs, and then you replace it with an alternative, unbiased response. In addition to a purely cognitive exercise, visual counter stereotypes can be used by identifying positive exemplars from the group that the bias is against. So 2 famous examples are using individuals such as President Obama or Kobe Bryant as exemplars of Black men. And in a study, individuals who were primed with images of positive exemplars before taking an IAT, they actually showed less racial bias. And this has been known in the literature as the Obama effect. You can also make it more personal through a process that's known as individuation, where you focus on an individual's personality traits rather than assumptions about a group. Whereas something like perspective taking is a common strategy to reduce bias, which we're all familiar with through sayings such as walk a mile in someone's shoes, which what it does is that actually increases the psychological closeness to a stereotyped group member, which then reduces the automatic group-based assumptions that we are conditioned to make through just our unconscious levels of living in the society. And now this last strategy that we're going to discuss is an application of contact theory, which stipulates that increasing opportunities to interact with members of a different group fosters increased empathy for the group. This process can lead to cognitive restructuring and tangible reductions in bias. And as I've been saying this, the term that's been blaring through my mind, that is probably blaring through yours as well, is CBT, CBT, CBT. That a lot of this is operating at the cognitive level of identifying thoughts and identifying where thoughts are coming from and replacing thoughts as well. And that's just in one way that some of the similar techniques and strategies that you use in a counseling space can translate into this space as well in helping people reduce their bias. Now, in thinking of best practices for trainings, it's important to tailor training, supports, and strategies to the audience and environment that you are in. The research also indicates that long-term interventions are more effective, which again is an aspirational thing in these situations, that you coming in as an outside counselor to a school saying, hey, go take a long-term implicit bias or anti-bias training may not land so well. So it's important to recognize where the school is at, what they're willing and able to do, but understanding that doing something is better than doing nothing. At the same time, we've all sat through half-day diversity trainings only to see that they have no impact, which is why what's really important is creating anti-bias as a value and building data analysis and accountability measures into the intervention to be able to see that change, which again sounds like the counseling skill of what goes in a treatment plan, making sure things are specific, measurable, using SMART goals, and trying to communicate those same ideas to a school for how they can work to use strategies to reduce bias?
I just want to kind of hammer home Rohan's last point about this can't be a one and done. Implicit bias training is actually getting a little bit of a bad rap right now because so many people do, a one-day diversity training or one-day implicit bias training, and this is a lifetime effort of reflection and monitoring and practicing of strategies to weed out implicit bias. So Rohan talked about some of the individual things. And again, we realize you all would be advocates. So we just want you aware of, if you were to engage with a school system, what you'd be looking for, what you could check off to say, oh, okay, they get it. They're equipped to deal with this. So first piece would be, some form of database decision making. This is how we become aware of the effects of implicit bias. I mean, people think that they're not expressing any bias. It's when you look at the data, then you see, oh my goodness, yes, there truly are disparities. So that has to be the first critical piece. And then, as Rohan said, building that culture of anti-bias being a value. So making training a priority, but not just a one and done. Building in that cultural responsiveness training, to get at what he talked about earlier with the individuation and the perception taking. That you're building in awareness into the school system and skills so that everyone is engaged and valued. And yet the school administration would set that tone, that atmosphere, so that staff would feel comfortable discussing and addressing and making mistakes and growing. All right, I think it's time to pause for a moment. Is that right? Anyone have any questions or reactions? We would love reactions, feedback.
And since we have such a small, intimate group, you feel free to unmute yourselves if you'd like to ask your question verbally, or feel free to also put something in the chat, and we'll take a few moments to answer any questions that you have or respond to any thoughts that you've been having, what you've been thinking as we've been discussing implicit bias trainings, counselor advocacy in school systems, what that looks like.
I see Cassandra, do you have your mic on? I don't know if you're trying to say something.
Yeah, Cassandra, it looks like you're trying to speak, but we're not able to hear anything. If you want to put your thoughts in the chat, please feel free to.
Starting to get something.
Sure.
Cassandra, I think your audio is breaking up, so if you wouldn't mind putting your question in the chat, we'd love to hear it and respond to it.
We agree. It is very painful. Particularly for thinking about young children experiencing this. Yes, we agree. We want to address it immediately. We're trying to get the word out and get as many advocates as we can. Ms. Mondrena, is that the end? I want to interrupt you. Balance it. Right, open the door without turning someone off. You're right, keeping the engagement going. It is a challenge, and that is where you need skilled trainers engaging with school systems.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm reminded of the idea that us as counselors, that counseling is as much an art as it is a science, and how we can use our art form as counselors to open that door and engage in that conversation in hopefully a way that doesn't, that keeps people from becoming defensive, that we can engage them in the conversation and say things to them in a way that they're open to hearing, and that we also hear you with that passion can get the best of you because it can get the best of all of us when this is such an important issue that we care so deeply about. And also, and especially not just an issue we care about, but people we care about, our clients, and how important this is. And sometimes, being able to take a step back almost and say, I need to reflect and remember that this is about a message. Exactly, approaching in a way that creates openness and dialogue. Not to show up in places like, you have bias, you're hurting this child, here's a 4-day training that you all need to take, but engaging with them. And at the end of our presentation, we're going to go a little bit deeper into how to approach those conversations in a way that we believe schools and other individuals as well will be more open to and receptive to hearing from us to create the change that we're looking for.
And I will say we have it in the resources, but one of my heroes right now is Emmanuel Ocho. He has a book out right now and a series on YouTube, Difficult Conversations with a Black Man. And if you ever hear, I've heard him on some podcasts, just his approach and his sense of grace when having these conversations and working with others. It's very inspiring. Just throwing out a resource. Any other questions?
Yes.
Reaction? Okay. So getting back to schools, and I talked about the data collection. We want you aware of what to look for, what components to be aware of when you're going to go advocate. So I mentioned the data. How is a school system identifying professional development needs, ideally using data to do that, but also working with the people in their schools. What are the needs they see? Working with families to find out what are families experiencing, what are they observing. So you're getting some really good stakeholder input. Looking at how school systems are creating buy-in, how are they setting the stage for trust and confidence that people can make mistakes and learn and grow. And again, as we said, this cannot be one and done. And then the last piece, some sort of accountability measures. How is that school system going to sustain this effort? Not make this a one-year initiative, but sustainable long-term reduction of implicit bias. Okay. So now at the teacher-child relationship level of advocacy, and I know some of you may work directly with teachers, and most of these things are going to be already familiar to you, but let's say you have a child in your practice and experiencing, you're hearing reports from the school of behavioral issues, or maybe this child has already been removed from a program. These are things to think about as you approach the teacher. Do they already have functional behavior analysis practices in place? Are they doing that antecedent work to find out what is happening for a child that would indicate, a behavioral issue? What's happening outside of school? Is this a trauma issue? Is this a mental health issue? Is this a physical issue? Is this a family issue? What's going on before you resort to suspending or expelling a student? One of the other problems that occurs with teachers is not defining a behavior problem and just applying a punishment without thinking through what really is this behavior from. So for example, children get suspended for something called non-compliance, not following directions, or defiant behavior. And that really is a perspective thing rather than a clear-cut behavior. And then, as we already know, discipline practices are applied in disparate rates across children. The social and emotional learning, what skills are those teachers trying to translate over to students? Are they using developmentally appropriate practices, which would include that individuation and perception taking? Really getting to know where a child is, what is just the right amount of challenging for a child. If teachers are using these practices, you see much fewer behaviors. And then that last piece, intergroup contact between peers and other strategies, is something Rohan mentioned earlier, making sure children are getting opportunities to have diverse contact. Our anti-bias curricula being used, and opportunities to embed children's cultures and experiences within the classroom. So these last few pieces are critical. This is, just context. What is a teacher's understanding of children's relationships, families, and their communities? There's so much room for bias with a lack of understanding of families' experiences, what's happening in the community. There's some research that shows many people, and this is where bias worms its way in. Research shows that many people believe that family engagement depends on how much the adults in a child's life, especially parents, how much they care. And again, that is an ambiguous definition. One person's perception of what caring is can be completely different given the context of a family or a community. And it's in building relationships with families and communities that teachers would gain a better understanding of children's experiences. As Rohan said, kind of that ecosystem of what's happening for children. Okay. And then school partnerships. This is your advocacy role if you choose to take it. building those effective partnerships and thinking through these components right here. If you're going to build partnership with school, you know, what are you able to contribute? What does your contribution look like? And how are you going to communicate with the school system about what you are willing to take on? Demonstrating shared values and a vision for this partnership. So setting the stage for that buy-in and the follow-through. And then as we talked about the measure for effectiveness, this keeps everyone accountable and sets the stage for that sustainability that I talked about earlier. And I'm seeing a comment from Cassandra. Yes, partnership is so important. Again, it's that trust. It's building that trust, and you're absolutely right. Teachers are overworked and feeling like they have someone that they can trust and grow with is most of what they're asking for. Sorry, Rohan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, so as we close out, we're going this last slide that we have, really, Cassandra, goes to the question that, or the thoughts that you were sharing earlier and are continuing to share, of just how difficult this is, because when we're advocating for children in the school system, achieving buy-in is not easy. And to us, we view that as it's not easy because of systemic level factors. It's not about that people don't care or don't want to. It's that there are barriers at the systems level of budgetary barriers, buy-in barriers from higher levels, or Cassandra, what you were saying earlier, that people may not be aware. And our challenge is, how do we make people aware in a way that they're open to hearing? And to what Beth was just saying, the first step is building that partnership, finding a way to connect with the teacher of, hey, this student is struggling, and we are both invested in this child's education and in this child's future. And quite frankly, if we can work to find a way that to resolve any issues that are happening, it's better for everyone involved. So here are, from our standpoint, just a few advocacy skills that we believe can be helpful when trying to build these partnerships and trying to engage in these conversations. And I see another chat from Cassandra that, yeah, making sure these things, do not expect that they'll happen overnight. It's an ongoing effort. It's long lasting. It takes time. As we're having this conversation, I'm more and more reminded of the parallels between building this partnership and building a therapeutic alliance with a client. You start with rapport building. You start with small talk. You start with those, simple, easier things. How's the weather? How's your day? Before you move into the big stuff, the heavy stuff. It takes time to build there. When we're engaging schools, just a few notes of what can be helpful. Number one to us is use evidence-based interventions, because it makes it easier for schools to say yes. That we believe schools want to say yes. They want to invest. They want to, do right by their children, by students. But we also have to speak their language. And sometimes, for higher levels of school administration, they need something that has an evidence-based backing to it, similar to how for insurance companies to reimburse counselors, we need to be using evidence-based practices and documenting that. The same type of idea that if we want them to invest financially and invest their time, they need to have a belief that it works in a way that they're open to hearing. Number two goes back to what we were speaking about earlier, is engaging the conversation in a way that allows and enables and really empowers our school partners to react non-defensively. Use those counseling skills when you're working with a client and you're trying to challenge them, or you're trying to tell them something that they may not want to hear. How you say it is more important than what you say. I believe that in counseling, what you say is less important than how you say it and when you say it, and that goes when engaging school partners here as well, building that trust, that relation, that rapport, and then finding a way to have that conversation, which for us, we believe the best way to go about it is by reminding school partners of mutual goals, that everyone here has the best interest of the child at heart. That is what everyone here is invested in doing, doing what is best for the student, the child, both for, at the individual, group, and systems level. And the more that you and we can bring it back to that of who this is really about, is the way that we believe is how you can engage in that conversation, have it be productive, and start to see the results and change that we all hope to see. So here's the resource list that we've been referring to a couple times. You can see there's a link for the IAT. There's also a link to this implicit bias review from the Kirwan Institute that outlines a lot of the research we've been discussing, as well as goes very in depth into certain other strategies, resources, materials. And this, some of the materials from the Kirwan Institute document can actually be very helpful for you to give to a school to make them more aware, and in a way to engage them through material that they are open to understanding and seeing. There are also several online modules of implicit bias trainings that you can refer to. Also, just to give you a context and language that you can use with the school system, how you can take some of the wording there and apply it and speak the language that schools need to hear. Lastly, some things about Children's Equity Project, cultural competence assessments. There's a few different other resources that can be helpful for you. So we see that we have a few minutes left for any questions. So again, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask a question verbally or put it in the chat for us. We'll stick around for a few more minutes to answer any questions or respond to any more thoughts that you all have. Otherwise, thank you so much for taking time out of your morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are, and spending it with us in this presentation. We really appreciate it.